So Clydette, back to Clydette, she is such a gifted speaker, singer, and pastoral caregiver. She has all of those qualities for the ministry. She's also a licensed therapist, having worked in family therapy and drug and alcohol related addiction therapy programs in Pennsylvania. What I appreciate most about Clydette is that she is so real and down to earth. She has genuine concern and care for others and carries a burden for justice, especially for those on the margin. As I shared before, she stood by my side in a big way during my church trial. I don't know that I could have faced the angry church mob without her and her husband, Ben, by my side. So thank you both for what you have done and what you continue to do. Clydette, before I ask you questions, do you want to share anything?
I didn't expect to be so emotional, but seeing the members of our past congregation together and seeing the faces of your new congregation, it just kind of overwhelmed me a little bit.
So let's go right into it. The first question I have for you, and this is supposed to be the easy warm-up question, right? Share with us, what are your top 3 fondest memories of working as a youth minister or assistant pastor?
This is a very fun warm-up question. The first thought that came to my mind was preparing children's sermons. I absolutely loved that, taking our sermon, whatever we were preaching, and making sure that we could share it with our children. And I mean, when I say children, I mean, we had really young kids that came up prior to the sermon. And I think I loved it. But my favorite part would be working all week on a sermon and then having the adults come up and say, boy, that children's sermon really ministered to me. And I would say, well, what did you think of the big kids sermon? And they would say, it was good. But that children's sermon, it really changed my life. So I would have to say children's sermon. And number 2, kind of piggybacking off of that, would be making the Bible relevant for little bitties and helping them understand the Word of God at their level, helping them be kind to each other, helping them respond to their parents, and kind of preventing bullying from the very start with our children's sermons. We did a good job of teaching children at a young age acceptance and inclusion and unending love. So I absolutely love that with the children's sermon. Finally, I would have to say my fondest memory would be you and I did a really good job of complimenting each other as a pastor and associate, and where my weaknesses were lied your strengths. And when we had stuff going on or we had a long week, whether it was Sunday service or a wedding or a funeral, we were really able to be there for each other. And that was the fondest memory I could think of, was working as your assistant, in terms of like, whatever you needed, the chaplain's assistant and me from the Army would come out and we would help each other. And if I was down and I was exhausted, not feeling it, because I was also in the seminary at the time that you had promoted me. So I was a seminary student, I was seeing clients as a therapist, and I was working as your associate. So it's a fond memory of helping each other with our human condition, but still giving worship and showing up on Sunday morning and just giving it all we had together. That memory will be with me for the rest of my life.
I remember you really helping me out of a squeeze a couple of times when I had talked myself into a corner in front of the congregation and I wasn't really prepared, and then you came through and you behind the scenes made it all happen. So I want to thank you for that. And the congregation never knew the difference. It was amazing. So
it was a good team effort.
Yes, absolutely. All right, question number 2. All right, can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing as a pastor's kid and beyond that time as well, if you want?
So our mother was raised Methodist and Christian. Our father was raised Catholic and turned atheist, believe it or not. He was drafted to the Vietnam War, and on the way to Vietnam, his plane crashed. He was burned over 80% of his body. He spent 5 years in a burn unit, and during that time he had professed that he was an atheist because he didn't believe that any God could allow a human to suffer as much as he suffered in that burn unit. And then we were born in New Jersey, but because of the burns and the recovery process, his doctors said, you need to move to a warmer climate. So he moved the whole family to Florida, and on the way, he met this gentleman in a campground who, the story is, led him to Christ, shared with him the message of God, and there was something about this man, and my father became a Christian, and he felt that he was called to become a pastor, and he entered a very conservative Southern Baptist seminary, and he became a pastor. And he had very trying times because we were in Florida and we were in a very racist area of the state. And we had a biracial couple in the congregation. And so he suffered some pretty bad backlash for allowing this biracial couple to sit together in the same pew, to play the organ together on Christmas. And he suffered a lot through that time. But at some point, his faith took a turn and he began to focus solely on the end times. And so a lot of my memories of being raised would be focusing on the end times and the idea that the Lord was going to return and there was going to be a rapture and then a period of tribulation. So my father's end of his ministry, before we lost our mother at a very young age to heart disease, he focused very much on preaching pretty much doom and gloom in terms of the Lord is going to return and so many people are going to be left behind. So I have a lot of memories in my upbringing of that time of his preaching and that time of his ministry.
Number 3, what is your fondest childhood memory and what is your least favorite one?
When I was thinking about this question, the initial thought was, wow, I don't have any fond memories of being a pastor's kid. And for any of you that know that life, it's a very difficult life to be a pastor's child. My sisters will agree. You pretty much live in a fishbowl. And when you misbehave, it's a reflection of your father, who is the pastor. And when you're good, it's still not kind of good enough. So I thought immediately I went to a negative space and thought, wow, I don't have fond memories. But then my sister, Anna, who's on, she helped me remember that my fondest memory would be happening upon a place called Woodlands Lutheran Campground. And it was a Lutheran campground that offered riding lessons for handicapped children and adults. And it was this giant campground, and snowbirds would come and live there in the off season. But in the fall, there was a equestrian program, and all the handicapped children and adults in the area could come and get riding lessons. And I was really young. I was a preteen, and I found myself volunteering, which meant you led the horses while the children rode, or you stood on the side of the animal to keep the child secure. And before I knew it, I became a member of the youth group in the Lutheran church there. And it really was life-changing. I was a really overweight child. I was really bullied for my weight. And I found this place at this Woodlands Lutheran campground. And I became alive. I just absolutely loved helping these handicapped kids through this ministry that this campground had. So that definitely my fondest memory would be the horse camp.
Would you say that, if you don't mind that I ask questions, but would you say that because of your own experience with bullying that you were able to really minister to these children better?
Yes, I think I had an understanding. I had a real compassion for like the severe disabilities. Like, for instance, I was really drawn to the autistic kids, but just the idea that a blind child could get on the back of a horse and see, and a child that was paralyzed could get on the back of a horse and walk. It was just overwhelming. It was such an addiction. And I was there pretty much every day. And we were homeschooled, so we were able to go constantly. My sister and I were really dedicated to it.
I wish you would share that one episode when you were like really little and you thought that Jesus had appeared and had left you behind. Could you share that with us? Because I thought that was in true fashion, you've jumped ahead in the notes there.
I did have that story planned, but it's good that we're mentioning in a humorous way. So we were really young. My sisters and I are not very far apart, because once my mother could have children, because she had lost quite a few babies, once she could have children, we're pretty close. Like my second sister and I are very close in age. And I remember we were very little, and my parents never went on a date because the pastor's life as it is, he was very busy. But this one particular time, they had arranged for a parishioner to babysit the four of us, because there's Clydette, Annette, Yvette, Lynette. There's four of us. We're a year and something apart. And we were waiting. We didn't know this, but a parishioner was coming over to babysit us so that my parents could go on a date. And we were left alone, which was rare. And there was this long period of time where we were alone. And so I said to my second sister, we need to start thinking, because the indoctrination at that point of the rapture was so real for us, that we had thought when our babysitter didn't arrive that actually the rapture had occurred and my parents had been taken, but we were left behind. And now when I did stand up for a short time, I did stand up comedy to pay the bills when I was in Bible college. This was a really good story. But when you look back at it, my sister and I talk a lot about how traumatizing we actually thought we had been left behind. So we began to count the canned goods and see how long we could have food before the end times would come upon us. And so now we can laugh because we've had lots of therapy. So now it's funny. But back then it was pretty traumatizing, because we actually thought the rapture occurred and mom and dad had been taken and the four of us little rugrats had been left behind. So it was a scary time. Least fondest memory, one of them.
Didn't you say something like, I thought I heard a trumpet or something like
Yes,
that?
our youngest sister, who could barely speak, she was a toddler. And she said in that, remember the old cartoons where the Yosemite Sam would say something and he would kind of have a stutter, and our sister was so young and she said, oh, I thought I heard a trumpet. And we're like, did you really hear a trumpet? We were so convinced that the rapture had happened, because that's all we were ever taught, was that the Lord was coming back and that we could be left behind if we were naughty children. So yeah, pretty traumatizing back then, but now it's kind of humorous.
All right. Well, speaking of traumatizing, my next question has something to do with trauma. So what are your most traumatic memories about the church in general and during your career in the ministry?
Sadly, I think the most traumatic memory was, I remember at an early age reading scripture and constantly feeling like I was not good enough. Like reading scripture and feeling and being taught, sadly, by our Father, that we were so flawed and so sinful and so fallen that without being rescued, we were basically, garbage as people. And when I thought about this question, I really thought how traumatic it really is to think constantly that you're not good enough and that you're in need of saving all the time, because there's something about your human condition that's so deprived. And so when I read that question, I thought to myself, absolutely believing that I didn't feel good enough. Now, sadly, when I found myself in the Lutheran church, it was during that time that I discovered that I had a passion for speaking, and I felt really strong that this was a gift. And I just remember my pastoral mentor telling me that I will never be a pastor as a woman. And it broke me. And so a traumatic memory would be realizing that I really loved the Lutheran church and I loved Woodlands Campground and I loved being part of the youth group, but I wasn't good enough. I wasn't going to be a pastor. I was never going to preach or teach, even though I knew that was my gift, was to preach and to teach and to lead. And so I that was so traumatizing for me in the Lutheran church to realize I'll never lead. I'll never speak in public. I'll never be a pastor because I'm a woman.
And Clydette, if I may piggyback on that, I remember the first time I asked you to speak at Iona, we had an argument and you argued that women can't preach. It's biblical. It's,
yes.
You can't do it. And so I finally got you convinced that you could do it, but then you said, but I'm not going to do it from the pulpit. I'm going to do it from a
Yes.
music stand. And
So your congregation needs to hear the story. You had noticed and seen in me that there was a gift for speaking, and I agreed as a lowly youth pastor, yes, I'll share a message, but I can't do it from the pulpit because, you know, clearly I had been told that women can't preach. So I said, I'll preach, but I need to preach using a music stand from the very bottom, lowest part of the physical church. Because if you can picture it, there's stairs, you know, ascending to the pulpit. And so you put up with that for quite a few times. And then finally you came to me and said, you know, I think it's time for you to preach in the pulpit. And I remember thinking, well, I can't preach in the pulpit because I'm a woman. And I remember you saying, that's unacceptable because you've been chosen by God to preach. And the first time I got in the pulpit, it was so overwhelming to think I'm allowed to be here. I'm a woman, but I have a message. And this pastor obviously trusts me with his entire congregation to minister. So something's got to be okay here if Pastor Frank will allow me. And then before we knew it, I was no longer preaching on the very bottom, lower level of the church. If I could have preached in the basement, I would have been mic'd in the basement because I was so scared to be in that pulpit.
Well, I'm glad that you overcame those prejudices, you know, that were laid in you, that were put in you. Because we really truly as a congregation and I as a minister enjoyed your messages so much and were inspired by them. So thank you for, you know, for having that open mind and for having that courage to step into that pulpit, even though it was indoctrinated into you that it wasn't okay.
Yes.
All right, question number 5. You are outspoken about leaving the Christian faith behind. How would you describe your spiritual journey since that time?
This is such a difficult question because when you start to talk about this with believers, there's such an aversion and there's such a panic. I met yesterday for lunch with a seminary friend of mine. She's on right now. She was very understanding to actually hear the story because anybody who knows me and identifies me as a Christian. And so when I say that I no longer really go by that label, it's very difficult and painful. We've lost family members on both Ben's side and my side. We've lost friends. It sounds dramatic, but I'm going to use the word, we've been abandoned by a lot of people who grew up knowing me as a pastor and a youth pastor and a chaplain's assistant in the United States Army. I most identify now morely as agnostic in the sense that I believe very much in a higher power. I taught that to clients as a therapist my whole career through Alcoholics Anonymous and NA. The journey has been amazing because since I left the organized religion part of it and ministry really, I've noticed a difference in my depression, my anxiety, my low self-esteem is improved. So I identify as spiritual. I absolutely am offended when someone calls me an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I very much believe in something out there, but what's shifted for me, and it started to happen when I was in Iraq. Actually, it started to happen in Bible college when I had questions about other belief systems. But when I was in Iraq, we would be in the middle of something really terrifying, and there'd be a firefight off in the distance, and we knew the war was getting closer to us. And the Muslims would put down their rugs and they would start to pray. And it really overwhelmed me to watch these people stop in the middle of fighting for their lives and pray to the God that they believed in. And it started to really affect me in the sense that, how am I the only right one? I had been taught my whole life from birth that we were the only right ones. My father used to preach and teach. The Jews weren't right. The Catholics weren't right. Anybody that didn't follow in line with Protestant Christianity, specifically charismatic belief, Pentecostal belief, preaching mainly the end times, was wrong. And when I saw those Muslims pray 5, 6, 8, 9 times a day, I remember coming home and having conversations with you. I'm struggling, because how are they the wrong ones and we're the right ones? And so there's been just an evolution in an inclusion for me, and understanding that we can't be the only right ones, and that we don't know the only way to heaven, and we don't have the only ticket. And so for me, it's just more of a more inclusive look at all belief systems that have the premise of being good people and treating the neighbor as thyself and giving back and paying it forward and accepting people and loving people, much like the entire life's work of Christ. So it's a spiritual journey, but I don't identify anymore as solely Christian. So that has lost us a lot of family members.
So when you say you don't identify as solely Christian, do you mean that some part of it still embraces some parts and aspects of Christianity?
Absolutely. I mean, till the day I die, I will be a #1 fan of the life of Christ. I try to live by it. I really wish there was a world in which we preached and taught and worshiped mainly as red letter Christians. And you know what I mean by that in terms of solely Jesus Christ, the life of Christ, and not getting so caught and choked up and tripping over the law. Yes, I do very much identify and still love parts of Christianity, but I can't live with the exclusion and the fear. I can't live with the theology of hell. I can't focus on the idea of a homosexual going to hell. I don't subscribe to any of it. I can't, because that's not the God that I believe is out there. So yes, there are parts of Christianity that my heart will always cling to.
So excuse me for adding questions, but I'm so curious about how would you say, when do you feel most spiritual? I mean, is there something that you do or that happens to you, or that you find yourself in moments when you feel like a connection with a higher power?
So I used to say, as a therapist, I used to tell clients, you need to go take classes on meditation, and then I never did it myself, which, just note to self, a lot of therapists will give you assignments and they might not do them themselves. But I ended up taking classes on meditation to actually learn how to do it right, because we have this concept when we say meditation, we're going to sit in a room and hum, and that's really not how it's done. So I would say now, when I do guided actual practice meditation, I feel my most connection to something outside of myself. I no longer pray and ask for things, because I don't subscribe to that anymore in terms of well, you didn't get it because it was God's will. That was a very painful thing for Ben and I, to constantly be told that, we weren't able to have a family and children because it wasn't God's will, or that even you leaving and going across the world to California when we lost you, well, that was God's will. And so we struggle really hard with that part of it. We don't enjoy that anymore. We don't feel spiritual when we get those limitations. But I would say meditation, as it's done correctly, which took me a lot of work, when I feel the closest, and when I'm just taking care of people, when I'm just being there for people and feeding people and just being there, listening to their problems, taking care of them. That's when I feel my most spiritual.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Question number 6. What do you experience as the most inconsistent and the most broken part in Christianity or the church?
I truly believe what has been broken is that the church in general, and I'm not naming denominations, I mean the actual church, the bride of Christ, has lost the original basic premise, which was love, love, love. Acceptance, acceptance, and love. And I don't like the word tolerance. I don't want to hear that. You tolerate your kids, you tolerate your spouse. Christians, we're called to love, love, love. And the broken part is that somehow along the line, due to selfish bias and and doctrinal beliefs and who's going to believe what and who's going to exclude who, we've lost the basic premise, which was that the original concept that Christ came to teach was never about the law or the rules or the judgment. It was about inclusion. He included everybody, the poor, the weak, the not so popular, women, children. He included everybody. There was never a clause by which he said you were not welcome. And for some reason, I feel like you can name a denomination right now in a church that I've been in, and people are constantly excluded. And I think that's the most broken part of Christianity. And that's the part that drove me away, because I can't do it anymore. After the trial and what you went through and what Tim went through, I couldn't tolerate it anymore. Literally telling somebody they weren't welcome based off of who they love or the color of their skin or what they do for a living or by their gender. So I think the most broken part would be losing that idea of love, love, love. It's very simple, but it's true.
Thank you so much for that, Clydette. And I know you're preaching to the choir here a little bit, but it's still so good to hear you say that and hear those words out loud. It's kind of like a confirmation, you know, to continue on the track that we have taken, of course, as a church too, as a reconciling church, to really extend a welcoming arm to everybody out there.
Yeah, I know my audience. It's fascinating because having spent time with Debbie, you know, Debbie's here. You all know that Pastor Frank's daughter is here in Pennsylvania, and we spend a lot of time with her now, which has been an amazing gift. And she tells me a lot about your congregation, and we think to ourselves, we would be part of a congregation like that. Like she told us so much of like what you're worried about saying on Sunday, they are open to hearing, because they're a welcoming, loving community. And I'm not lying to you or exaggerating when I tell you, and your Iona people are probably going to shake their heads right now when I say this. That wasn't our experience. So your congregation now was not what we lived through at Iona. Never. And the people that are on right now are the only reasons that Pastor Frank, you and I survived as long as we did, because they believed what your current congregation does, which is love, love, love. And that to me gives me faith in the Christian church and hope, you know, hope that it could be different.
So last question. And then we're going to open it up to questions from everybody. But the last question is also very important. What advice do you have for us in order to fix what is broken in the church? And I'm talking about the church in general, as you said, the bride of Christ. What would we be able to do to make a change?
So I even have butterflies giving this response, which is my old pathology as a Christian. I'm already nervous saying this, but my heart has to say this. I really wish and dream of a church that stops preaching the theology of hell. The concept that people are going to burn or be smitten, whatever's grammatically correct there, because they fall out of way, or they take a misstep, or they commit a sin. I would really love for us to stop teaching hell to young children who grow up in a world that is so scary. And yet we preach and teach to them, you better do what you need to do, because on the other side, there's this terrible place that you could end up if you ever betray God. So the idea of the theology of hell upsets me so much. And you know what scares people that are in our lives is that when I tell them I don't fear hell, because, you know, unfortunately, I'll be very candid with you all. Just recently, it was revealed to me that one of my very own sisters, not my sister who's supporting me today, who's on, believes that I am satanic and fallen, and that I'm going to hell. The theology of hell is so unhealthy from a mental health perspective. And then inside of that, why do we still cling to such archaic laws that are irrelevant to our modern life? Why are we preaching about homosexuality as a sin? Why are we preaching that women aren't good enough? Why? Why is the church still holding to cover your face and keep your mouth shut if you're a female? There's so many archaic laws that have nothing to do with the modern day church or the way the world is designed today. And I just really wish we could stop teaching those negative lessons and focus on the premise of Christ's life. You know, Christ's whole life was nothing about damnation and burning and you're not good enough, and everybody was always good enough for him. That's why he talked to the people that others wouldn't spend time with. So I just really wish we would stop with the hell theology and the irrelevant archaic scripture. I think that could change the church as we know it. And I think you and I have discussed this. Christianity is losing followers at an all-time high. And part of it is people are getting healthier because people are subscribing to mental health help. And they're discovering, I don't want to follow a belief system that constantly tells me I'm a piece of garbage and I'm going to burn in eternal flames. So I really believe if the church could tweak that and get away from this historic belief system that doesn't do anything good but scare people, which only leads people to spend more money, which is the purpose of that theology, is to buy your way out of it. We see that in Catholicism. I really, really wish we could stop teaching that negative theology. I think that that would be amazing advice. I don't think it applies to your church, but I think it might apply to people your members know.
Yeah, possibly. But while you were talking, I remembered a time at Iona in Lebanon when I was asked to please deliver a sermon on hell. I don't know if you remember that or not.
I do.
And so I felt obliged because, you know, as pastors, we always try to please everybody, which is impossible, but we try anyway, right? So I did end up preaching a sermon on hell, but it was more humorous than anything. And then at the end, I had a confession that I can't really believe in it. So it was kind of defeating the purpose. And I don't think the concerned group was very happy about that.
No.
Sermon.
That sermon did not get you your best reviews because you took the fear out of it. And this obsession with scaring people into salvation, it breaks my heart. Like the idea of Jesus never scared anybody. It's not like whenever he spoke, he was constantly scaring the people. But there was this obsession within certain members of our congregation. I remember they pressured you more than once to preach on hell. More than once.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that finally gave in, but
yeah,
it wasn't what they expected. But maybe they wanted me to show true colors too. I don't know what the strategy behind that was, but I did. Interestingly, I did finally find out why there were people in that congregation and in other congregations that were opposed to like anything that was fun or, you know, like even hand clapping, you know, applause or children's sermons or laughter in church. And after years, I finally found out what it was. And I recently shared that with my congregation. And it's a little disturbing, but to me, but I found out that there are people that need church to be a torture, like a preview of hell, or else they won't feel that they did their duty and they can't be forgiven. They need to be told in the service, you are a sinner, you need to repent, you need to come to the altar, shape up, and it has to be really stern and scary, and the fear of God has to be put on them. And then they feel now they're sort of sanctified after the service. And if they don't have that, then something's wrong. And if it's fun, then what's the purpose of church to them? So
and as a therapist, if you take all the religious part out of it and you try to view it just from a mental health perspective, how unhealthy is that? Because fear, we've learned something in the mental health world. Fear does not work. It doesn't keep you sober. It doesn't keep you faithful to your spouse. It doesn't help you. Fear is not a motivator. That's why the scared straight programs don't last, because you can only scare a kid so many times to behave before they're going to commit another crime if it's within who they believe they are. The idea of fear within religion it dumbfounds me because it's absolutely so unhealthy. And there is this obsession. And I was thinking about this. For many of you that might know the Lutheran background, in the Lutheran Church, every single Sunday, we stand up and say, we are human garbage. We are not good people. We are in need of this. We are in need of that. We say it every Sunday. And I remember as a teenager thinking to myself, and I wanted to talk to my, at the time, pastoral mentor, why do we have to hate ourselves so much to have God love us? And I was so scared to talk to him about it because I just knew it wasn't going to go well. I knew it wasn't going to, and I kept it inside, and I would recite that scripture, and I would feel so terrible about myself. And then all week long, I'm trying to work to redeem myself in the eyes of God, in the eyes of my pastor, in the eyes of my father, in the eyes of my professor. And I never quite got there. And I just thought, wow, I just feel like we're really missing the gospel here, because I just feel like garbage about myself after those services.
And let's not forget, I mean, not just from a therapeutic viewpoint, but also if you follow the life and teachings of Jesus, he was fighting against the system of fear that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other religious leaders were putting on the people. They were squeezing them. They were like trying to scare them into submission, I guess, and into heaven. Whereas Jesus totally fought that, and his approach was, as you said, acceptance and love, you know, and telling people.
Because fear was such a financial motivator when the church was first being constructed. Like, you had to fear those people in order to give to those people, in order to build those empires. So fear was, it's really is like the breaking ground of some of our denominations. And that breaks my heart. And I never really realized that till I became a therapist, how many clients I would have, and we would be getting to know each other. And you would think I'm tracing the fear back to their parents or to childhood memories, but the fear somehow would always be connected to their theology. And it would break my heart as a therapist, because I was a believer. I was still in ministry, but to get through to them that a lot of their fear and their low self-esteem and the way they hate themselves actually had to do with their theology, not their parents, that was so profound for me when I realized, wow, I think I really don't like myself, not really because of my mom and dad, but kind of because of my church. That was a real big moment for me.
Very, very sad. So at this point, I'd like to invite anybody here who has a question for Clydette. You know, go ahead and ask it, but please know that we're actually recording this. So if you don't want to be on the recording, then you should probably not do it.
Very diplomatic. Very well said.